Expect disruptions on major transport routes this weekend. Truck drivers plan to embark on another blockade on Sunday. This includes the N3 between Johannesburg and Durban. The All Truck Drivers Forum says complaints about employment of foreign nationals have fallen on deaf ears for years. Gavin Kelly heads up the Road Freight Association and joins us now. Gavin, thanks so much for speaking to us this evening. You've been on task teams and consultative forums to deal with this issue. Are these drivers justified in saying there's been no movement on addressing the foreign driver concern?
Good evening, Anli, and good evening to all your viewers. And I suppose South Africa sitting on tented hooks about what's going to happen in the next couple of days. The task team has been working hard at some things, and I suppose there are those who feel it hasn't been working hard at others. And one of those things has been the actual employment of foreign drivers in the road freight and logistics industry. And that is something that needed to be understood in two aspects. The first was, how do these individuals get to be employed in the industry in preference to local South African citizens or South African citizens? And the second thing was the understanding of how one would stop that happening if there is such a predominance or if there are so many foreigners being employed in the industry. So it's taken a number of years. Some people have said it's taken 7 years. It's probably taken a lot longer than that. Definitely the task team was formed towards the end of 2022. And there has been 18 months of meetings. I think the Road Freight Association would like to have seen things happening faster, but we do have two important lines in the sand. And the first one is that as of the 30th of June 2023, those individuals who are employed in South Africa through something else other than a work permit will no longer be legal. And there's a lot of talk around the so-called ZDP, because that seems to be the mainstay of what drivers use to be employed in, definitely in our industry. There are other industries that have something different, obviously. So that's the first thing. And it's important to understand that as of the 1st of July, things should change in the country. The second thing, which is probably far more important than this line in the sand of a date, is that the Department of Labour has committed itself to ensuring that they do far more inspections of employers and deal with those employers who are employing illegal or those foreigners who don't have work permits.
So this blockade is happening on a busy long weekend, and I'd imagine that not only motorists will be frustrated, but also businesses waiting for goods to be delivered. They're going to experience some delays. What communication have you received regarding the planned protest?
Well, it's been rather difficult only to first of all understand where it's coming from. The very first sets of communication that started to circulate on social media didn't involve the ATDF-SA. It involved a group that nobody actually knew of. It was called South African Truck Drivers. And who are South African truck drivers? In the main, are they going to be South African citizens who are employed by companies in South Africa? Or is it a small grouping of affected individuals who aren't employed? Or is it a grouping of individuals who are employed? So that was the first thing, was trying to ascertain where this was coming from. A couple of weeks ago, the social media announcements changed slightly, and we saw that the ATDF-SA was mentioned as supporting this. And that is not a surprise, because some of the points that have been raised by this South African truck drivers grouping refer to a number of points in the task team and also refer to the task team. I'm sure you would have seen, and your viewers would have seen, they spoke to one of the most important things was how long this task team was taking, and there seemed to be no real development, no real outcomes. There are a couple of other points in their social media notices. So first of all, it was really to understand who it was. Once we had an understanding of what was happening, then of course there were various negotiations or various discussions, let me rather put it that way, between various parties. We need to understand that truck drivers in South Africa, employed truck drivers, have the choice of either being represented by a union, and there are a number of unions in our sector, or they can decide not to be represented by a union. some of the things that have been raised by this South African truck drivers grouping are things that are contained within the general agreement or the main agreement in our sector, which is an agreement in terms of certain conditions of employment, which is agreed between the employees as represented by the unions and by the employers as represented by employment associations like the RFA or CEO or NIASA. Those are the three organizations that are at the bargaining council.
Gavin, investors look at these kind of protests. They don't often look so much into the detail of the machinations of a protest, but they look at the impact it has and they decide to go elsewhere. So how do we address the issue timeously without being in a situation where we have to wait for that line in the sand that you refer to, that date, the 1st of July, to have an effect? Because we don't know what's going to happen on the 1st of July. We don't know whether we have the kind of home affairs or policing capacity to then deal with the amount of foreigners who are going to find themselves in the country, who had previously relied on that ZEP to stay in the country legally, who will then suddenly, over the course of one day, be here illegally, and we don't know, whether the Department of Labour, in fact, has the capacity to drastically increase their inspections and their audits of freight companies to make sure that they are adhering to the employment regulations. So, is there a way to expedite the matter, as it were, to avoid these kind of protests in the future?
Only there are a couple of huge questions in that little piece that you've asked me. So let's go to the very first part, which is the effect it has both on the country, on its logistics chains, and on how the rest of the world sees us. You will have noted that the association has, over the last number of years, drawn attention to the long-term effects this can have, to the detriment both to our economy, in terms of both employment, in terms of the types of revenues we generate in the support structures, in terms of the freight moving through the country. So that's not a secret. If we don't sort these sorts of things out, these sorts of protests, then the rest of the world is going to say, well, is South Africa a place that we'd really want to either put our goods through or send our goods through or use as a transit country, or somewhere we'd like to do business with? Definitely. And absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head. The second question is, can we not expedite this? The question really is a difficult one to answer, because if we don't have the structures in place, so for example, if Home Affairs or Department of Labour doesn't have the capacity to do the investigations or the inspections and to do the follow-up checks, then we're really stuck. And whatever happens on the 30th of June will be moot, because when we know we are not going to be able to implement that. And then finally, could we make it any sooner? Are we sure that on the 1st of July there's going to be a change? We need to understand once again that there are going to be processes that need to happen. So the transport register number, for example, companies employing foreigners, if there's no check to make sure that when you employ somebody, there is a process that ensures that you've ticked the boxes, jumped through the hoops, then we're going to really be back to where we are right now. And that's the frightening thing. We do not have the confidence right now that we're going to be able to ensure that we can get this sort of problem out of our employment challenges.
Certainly a worrying situation with the eye on the future. It doesn't look like our rail infrastructure is going to get up and going anytime soon. So we are incredibly reliant on our freight network, and we need to get it sorted. But thank you so much for your insights. That was Gavin Kelly from the Road Freight Association, giving us some insights into that protest or blockade planned for Sunday on the N3 and some other major routes.